Without a goal out there somewhere, it would be a simple matter to become an automaton, a cipher, an empty doll-like figure simply going through the motions, getting up, moving through the day, and going to bed again. Having a goal is why some of the unlikeliest seeming people who seem to us to have nothing whatever to bring happiness into their lives, are often the most cheerful people we'll see all day. You can bet that there's a goal there, something held in the heart and seen only in the mind, toward which they're moving, something that makes it all wonderful for them. In fact, that's the very definition of happiness. We're happiest when we're moving towards something we want to bring about. The secret is in the two words, moving toward.
One of the truly great and inspiring teachers was a man by the name of William Lyons Phelps. He was a professor at Yale University for about, I'd guess 40 years. He was also a literary critic and the author of a great many fine things. He was loved by everyone who knew him, and he died in 1943 at the age of 78. I was poking around in my library looking for something worth sharing with you when I came across a little short thing that William Lyons Phelps had written called One Day at a Time. I think it's terrific, and it goes like this. We look backward too much, and we look forward too much. Thus we miss the passing moment. The fear of life is the favorite disease of the 20th century. Too many people are afraid of tomorrow. Their happiness is poisoned by a phantom. Many are afraid of old age, forgetting that even if they should lose their bodily vigor, weakness itself may minister to the development of the mind and spirit. In the words of the aged poet Waller, the soul's dark cottage, battered and decayed, let in new light through chinks that time has made. Stronger by weakness, wise men become, as they draw near to their eternal home. Let the scientists worry about our origin, he wrote. Let the prophets worry about our future, the decline of Western civilization and whatnot. Some people are alarmed because in 9,000 billion years the sun's fuel may give out. Instead of chagrin over our past and alarm over our future, suppose we consider our opportunity. Listen to Emerson. Write in on your heart that every day is the best day in the year. No man has earned anything rightly until he knows that every day is doomsday. Today is a king in disguise. Today always looks mean to the thoughtless in the face of a uniform experience that all good and great and happy actions are made up precisely of these blank todays. Let us not be deceived. Let us unmask the king as he passes. Well, I think Dr. Phelps, with an assist from Emerson, have well made a point worth making. If we could only get out of bed each morning realizing that today is a day not unlike those on which the greatest and most exciting events of history have taken place, that today represents another opportunity on the road to whatever greatness it is we seek, and that finally today will take its place as a single tile in the mosaic of our finished life, to either add to its beauty and harmony or detract from it, or lose itself in a dull gray background of an uninteresting, unchallenged, undedicated existence. I particularly liked Emerson's admonition to know that today could be the last, which makes it important, and that today is a king in disguise. Let us not be deceived. Let us unmask the king as he passes. And above all, don't be frightened about tomorrow, but concern yourself with the eternal present. A man named Richmond wrote, "There is a time to be born and a time to die," says Solomon, and it's the memento of a truly wise man. But there is an interval between these two times of infinite importance.
Among the writings of Henry David Thoreau, I came across this statement. Many an object is not seen, though it falls within the range of our visual ray, because it does not come within the range of our intellectual ray. In other words, there are many things that exist in our world that we don't see because we're not looking for them or perhaps even capable of looking for them. So in the largest sense, the world we see is only the world we look for. Show two people the same picture and each will see a different scene. Each will extract from what he sees that which he happens to be predisposed to look for. Different people looking out of a train window as they pass through the outskirts of a city will see the same thing from entirely different viewpoints. One will see a depressing, run-down neighborhood. Another will see an ideal plant site. Still another might see a marvelous opportunity for real estate development. The passing scene might give someone else an idea for a story or a song or a poem. Another, his face buried in a magazine, will see nothing. The world presents to each of us every day that which we seek. There's not a neighborhood or area that doesn't offer abundant opportunity to every person there. That opportunity is limited only by the viewpoint of the inhabitant. Some years ago, a Wisconsin farmer was stricken with polio and left paralyzed in an iron lung. Flat on his back, unable to farm his land, he was forced to push back his intellectual horizon. He was forced to think creatively, to take mental inventory of his assets and liabilities. Without moving from his bed, he built one of the country's largest and most successful meatpacking companies. Unable to use his hands and feet, he was forced to use his most precious, his most priceless possession, his mind, and he found his farm contained all the riches he and his family would ever need. Where before there was only a farm, now there are great packing plants employing thousands. I'm sure that when his friends and neighbors learned of his affliction, they wondered how he would manage to operate his farm and care for his family. He simply looked at the farm with new eyes. He saw what he had failed to see before, even though nothing had changed except his own mobility. Every one of us lives in a kind of iron lung of his own fashioning. Each one of us has opportunities just as great as that Wisconsin farmer's. But few of us are forced to reach so far into the deep reservoirs of ability within us, and fewer still know the joy and excitement and never-ending interest that can be found in our daily lives when we learn to look at our world as Thoreau looked at his. Surrounded by miracles and limitless opportunity, some people manage to find only boredom and insecurity. As Thoreau said, we find only the world we look for. One time when I was in New York City, my plane was canceled because of mechanical difficulties. More than 100 of us, I suppose, were now left to scramble for another flight to our destinations on a busy, crowded afternoon. I went back to the counter, and a woman told me there was another flight in just an hour. "But won't that be filled?" I asked. "Well, maybe not," she said. I thought of all the people who had been canceled out on my flight, fighting for seats on the next one, which was already probably completely booked, and I toyed with the idea of staying overnight and making a new reservation for the following morning. "Why don't you try it?" she said. The thought of standing around the airport for another hour only to be turned away from a full flight was very unappealing. "Do you think there's any hope at all?" I asked. "Try it," she said. So I tried it, and I wound up with a window seat up front and was only an hour late arriving at my destination. If I hadn't tried it, I would have had to taxi all the way back into the city, register at a hotel, spend the night, and repeat the whole process the next day. I'd been saved all that by a woman who suggested that I try it, and I resolved to stop giving up so easily, to keep my expectations alive, to expect more. This is a small example, but we should never lose sight of the undeniable fact that there is a very thin line, if any at all, between what we expect from life and what we get. If we're not getting what we'd like, maybe it's because our expectations are too low. Maybe we're suffering from the poverty of expectation. Your life will come pretty close to matching your expectations. It can easily exceed them. Higher expectations keep us trying. They keep us pressing upon ourselves. They keep us from giving up. When I was a kid, I remember hearing the words, "If you don't expect much, you won't be disappointed when you don't get much." But that's just the problem. If you don't expect much, you're ruling out the chance of winning. The world is full of people who don't have much because they don't expect much. They're not trying for more, so how in the world are they going to get more? We should never be concerned about the opportunities we've missed in the past. There's no way on earth to make the most of every opportunity. It's almost never too late, and there will be just as many good opportunities in the future as there have been in the past. No one is without hope. Every person has expectations of some kind. But just as we tend to underestimate ourselves, we therefore expect too little. We have expectations, but are they high enough? As Goethe put it, in all things it is better to hope than to despair. It might be a good idea to take inventory of our expectations. Maybe we could use a new shipment. We become what we habitually think about. I read a comment in Forbes magazine by Henry George. He said the fundamental principle of human action is that men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. And there's the rub. That's the difference between what we say we want and what we're willing to settle for. It's like the high school kid who tells his counselor that he wants to be a physician and whose grades are C's and D's. Sure, he wants to be a doctor, but only if there isn't too much hard work involved. I've often thought that therein also lies the crux of the mid-career identity crisis so common among men. He wakes up one morning, usually a rainy Monday, looks at himself in the mirror before he's showered and shaved, and gets a world record sinking feeling. He's 40, and he suddenly realizes those insurance people know what they're talking about when they deal in mortality tables, and that there's one whopping disparity between what he's accomplished and what he used to think he'd accomplish. And often a very similar crisis happens to women. What happened, though, he wonders? Where did all those years go? And what's he been doing all that time? And more importantly, where's he going? What about all those young dreams? Voila, identity crisis. He's not the person he intended to become. And what happened was that he was comfortable. He had a job he could handle with raises along the way, 3 square meals a day, a family, these are not in the order of their importance necessarily, a house, well, actually it was what the other guys were doing too, and then those young dreams had been a bit amorphous, a little fuzzy around the edges. The thing is that while he may not be the person he intended to become, he's the person he settled for. He really has what he wanted after all. I had a call the other day from an older woman I know, and she said, you know, when I was a girl, I wanted more than anything to learn to play the piano, but my parents couldn't afford it, and there was a super private school I wanted to go to, but they couldn't afford that either. I asked her if she'd learned to play the piano later on after she left home. She said no. I reminded her that she could have learned to play every instrument in the Boston Symphony during the time she'd wasted since then. I told her that blaming her parents was the easy way out. People who love to play an instrument or seek a good education can do it one way or another, even if they have to teach themselves, as countless individuals have proved. So I won the argument and infuriated a nice woman. I had exploded a myth she'd been clinging to for 40 years, and I reminded her that there was still plenty of time.
If you were given the opportunity to pass along to your kids one piece of advice, say you had only 30 seconds to say it, what would it be? I've always been interested in the advice parents pass along to their youngsters. In reading of an interview between Jeannie Sokol and Dr. Margaret Mead, which appeared in McCall's magazine some time back, the distinguished anthropologist and author, Dr. Mead recalled her grandmother as one of that rare breed of women who understood the nature of change and the need to be prepared for the unknown. And she said, this generation must discover how to bring up children to live in this unknown world, how to bring them up without absolutes. My grandmother taught me, she said, to nest in the gale, which is why I'm still around. The greatest gift we can give our children is to teach them to nest in the gale. I think it's particularly good advice for girls. Of course, this isn't something you just pass along as a bit of advice and then forget about it. It's something that has to be taught as a way of life, or as is any worthwhile philosophy. But it's a good one, isn't it? To nest in the gale, to be able in the whirlwinds of change and the tremendous upheavals that have rocked our world and will continue to rock it, to build for yourself and your family a calm, rock-solid place in the midst of it all. Like the seabirds that nest high in the storm-battered cliffs, to be able to have so secure a basic foundation that the storms can be weathered, and the young can fly out at last to build their own nests when the time comes. This means teaching the youngsters that the only thing we can count on absolutely is change, constant, never-ending change, and to understand that there is as much opportunity in change as there is danger, that courage and creativity can make a slave of change, and that change, however disruptive, holds the only hope for the future of mankind. If we're at last to conquer all disease, it must come through change. If we're to give every person on earth a decent, nutritious diet, it must come through change. If we're to have peace, if we're to tap at last the true potential of man to transcend himself, it will come through change. So change is not just inevitable, it's our only hope for the future. If young people look at change in this light, they will welcome it, knowing that they're going to have to take a few knocks along with the good. So as Dr. Margaret Mead says, maybe the greatest gift we can give our children is to teach them to nest in the gale, so that they'll be able to fly in good health and clear skies when the gale has passed, as pass it must.
Peter Drucker, the well-known management consultant on the subject of getting into the right kind of work, has said, People worry because they think a career decision is like marriage, to be broken only by failure or death. Well, this just isn't so. You have to accept your uncertainties as normal. Only musicians and mathematicians and a few early maturing people, the number is very small, know from adolescence onward what they want to do. But the rest of us have to find out. Well, that's good. In the world of today, there are so many interesting opportunities, it's quite difficult for most people to make a perfect decision the first time. Perfect or not, it seems that most people largely do look upon their work as they might look upon marriage, as a permanent thing. If it's not what a person happens to like, well, he often thinks that's just too bad. He's stuck with it. Well, not so, not anymore. I read somewhere recently that one of the tragedies of our educational system is that it often steers young men into the more acceptable or better-known fields simply because it's easier to get them to conform to the curriculum than for the school to branch out into less popular studies. Thus, the young man who dreams of being an oceanographer or expert on pollution winds up being a lawyer or a CPA. But be that as it may, the person who dreams of more interesting, more challenging, and perhaps more rewarding work should ask himself quite seriously, and I don't mean more rewarding than being a CPA or a lawyer, that can be as rewarding as anything else, but he should ask himself quite seriously what it is that prevents him from fulfilling his dream. No matter what field a person chooses, there's always room. People in that field are getting older, they're moving up and out, they're retiring. If a person can think of the field he would like very much to enter, chances are he can get into it if he's willing to make a few sacrifices. It might mean going back to school or starting all over at the bottom. But if he wants it enough, well, he can get into it. Remember, too, that it used to be that most people in most jobs were restricted to work in the country of their birth. Today, the whole world, or at least a big part of it, is available. Opportunities are literally everywhere. From A to Z, from aviation to zippers, there's a kind of work that can be congenial and interesting for just about anyone, if he'll go to the trouble of discovering what it is and then qualifying for it. As I may have mentioned 400 or 500 times before, the luckiest people on earth are those who enjoy and can find personal fulfillment and satisfaction in their work. As the man said, only musicians and mathematicians and a few early maturing people, the number is very small, know from adolescence onward what they want to do. The rest of us have to find out. An accomplished woman musician gave a great piano performance for a woman's club. Afterward, over coffee, an admirer from the audience gushed to the virtuoso, "I'd give anything to play as you do." Whereupon the woman who'd given the concert took a sip of her coffee and fixed the red-faced, slightly perspiring matron with a cold gaze, and she said, "Oh, no, you wouldn't." Well, a hush fell over the group. Coffee cups stopped on their ways to and from the saucer, and the culprit twitched in sudden embarrassment. Looking about as she repeated, but in a softer voice, her original statement, "I would, too, give anything to play the piano as you do." The virtuoso continued to sip her coffee and shake her head. "No, you wouldn't," she repeated. "If you would, you could play as well, possibly better, possibly a little worse than I do. You'd give anything to play as I do, except time, except the one thing it takes to accomplish the fact. You wouldn't sit and practice, hour after hour, day after day, year after year." Then she flashed a warm smile. "Understand," she said, "I'm not criticizing you. I'm just telling you that when you say you'd give anything to play as I do, you really don't mean it. You really don't mean it at all." In the pause that followed, a napkin falling to the thick rug would have rattled the windows. The women looked at each other and then back at their coffee cups. They realized that this woman had spoken the truth. They would like to have her talent now, fully matured and developed, but as for putting in the 20 years of work that went into the fashioning of it, no, that was a different matter. Soon the light conversation was resumed, and the incident was glossed over, but not forgotten. People are forever saying, "Oh, I'd give anything," but the fact remains that they don't. They give very little, often nothing, to do the things they say they'd give anything to do. The actor who envies the pinnacles reached by the stars, the small business person, the homemaker, the student, the golfer, the professional person, the aspiring writer, the painter, across the entire spectrum of achievement, the stars are those who have simply given their dedication, their singleness of purpose, their days and nights, weeks and months and years, and when the harvest they have so painstakingly sown and nurtured for so long begins to be reaped, There are others with the same time, the same opportunity, the same freedom, who come up to say, I'd give anything to be able to do what you're doing, to have the things you have. But as the pianist said, I'm just telling you that when you say you'd give anything to play as I do, you really don't mean it. You really don't mean it at all. Each of us has the time and the opportunity. If we say we haven't, we're trying to kid ourselves. Everybody ought to become great at something. What is it that you'd give anything to become? Well, then give it, and you'll become it. Sometimes it seems as though there are far too many spectators and not enough players. Maybe we're so busy watching the world and everyone else we forget we've got one of our own to win. Opportunities and problems come in all sizes, from the very small to the very large. There's no such thing as an opportunity without problems, or problems without opportunities. They're two sides of the same coin. But it's how we react to them that determines what sort of people we are, and how serene or frustrated, successful or unsuccessful we ultimately become. Look at it this way. The better prepared, the more skilled and experienced we become, the larger the opportunity we can handle, because we've learned to handle the problems that go with it. But at the same time, you can't handle, you might not even recognize, a large opportunity if you permit yourself to be bothered by small problems. If a person is to mature, reach his full stature as a human being, he must learn to sail over the thousands of small, unimportant problems and irritations that beset all of us. If he permits himself to become involved with the numerous small, unimportant vexations, petty arguments, real or imagined personal slights, the interminable minutiae of life, he'll spend all the years of his life in the shallows. As we've said before, a person is only as large as the things he lets bother him. He's only as big as the things he lets interest him. In discussing this not long ago, I got to thinking that people are like sailing craft, and you can compare life itself to an ocean. Now think of the people you know, and think of yourself as vessels. The smallest would be a little skiff that bounces and bobs even in calm weather over the smallest waves. It isn't safe to go to sea in a boat that small. It'll be swamped by the first large wave that comes along. From the smallest vessel, let's now go to the largest ocean liner. It doesn't even feel the small waves in the harbor. Not until it reaches the great swells of the open sea does it begin to compensate for roll and pitch, and even the worst storms find it equal to the task. It might arrive in port a day or two late, but it'll get there safely with its passengers and cargo. Now, what kind of a vessel are you? Are you the big liner that sails serene and confident far out into the deep open sea, that pays no attention to the small or even medium-sized waves that break and disintegrate against its tall sides? Or are you the small rowboat that bobs and rocks in the slightest breeze? As James Allen put it so beautifully, the strong, calm person is always loved and revered. He's like a shade-giving tree in a thirsty land, or a sheltering rock in a storm. Who does not love a tranquil heart, a sweet-tempered, balanced life? It doesn't matter whether it rains or shines, or what changes come to those possessing these blessings, for they're always sweet, serene, and calm. That exquisite poise of character, which we call serenity, is the last lesson of culture. It is the flowering of life, the fruitage of the soul. Ships and people come in all sizes. We stop to watch and admire the great ships, while the small craft in the harbor attract only a passing glance. What kind of craft are you? The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that adversity introduces a person to himself. On the occasion of every accident that befalls you, remember to turn to yourself and inquire what power you have for turning it to use. Opportunity beckons more surely when misfortune comes upon a person than it ever does when that person is riding the crest of a wave of success. It sharpens a person's wits, if you let it, enabling him to see more clearly and evaluate his situation with a more knowledgeable judgment. It's been my observation that people seem to be growing more and more fearful of risk of any kind. They seem bent on an almost frantic scramble for security without taking the time to think it all the way through. There's only one form of security we can attain during our lives, and it's inner security, the kind that comes from courage, experience, and the ability and the willingness to learn, to grow, to attempt the unknown. Security isn't what the wise person looks for. It's opportunity. And once we begin looking for that, we find it on every side. You can measure opportunity with the same yardstick that measures the risk involved. They go together. The famous World War II Admiral William Bull Halsey said, "Touch a thistle timidly, and it pricks you. Grasp it boldly, and its spines crumble. All problems become smaller if you don't dodge them but confront them." I think we all know that, but we tend to forget it between problems. All problems become smaller if you don't dodge them but confront them. I particularly like Epictetus's line that adversity introduces a person to himself. Now that's when we get to really know ourselves. That's when we come face to face with the real person we are and the stage of our maturity or growth to that point. It does no good at all to worry about times in the past when we failed to measure up in our own eyes. We weren't ready yet. We hadn't at that point in our lives matured sufficiently. We weren't wise enough. Besides, that's in the past. It's how we stand up to trouble now that matters, and we should keep in mind the truth and wisdom contained in his advice that opportunity beckons more surely when misfortune comes upon a person than it ever does when that person is riding the crest of a wave of success. Most very successful people can remember that their success was discovered and built out of adversity of some kind. It's not the problems that beset us. Problems are surprisingly pretty much the same for millions of others. It's how we react to problems that determines not only our degree of growth and maturity, but our future success, and perhaps much of our health. It's good to get rid of that word security once and for all. It makes us feel free again, as we felt as children, and we begin to see what this business of living is all about. We begin to really enjoy it.
Have you ever given much thought to the idea that the spoils in life go to the risk-takers? If you'll give it some thought, I think you'll come up with the same solution I arrived at. A survey indicated that 98% of the men in the country are looking for security in their work. That is, they're mainly interested in losing themselves deep in the warm, nourishing viscera of some large corporation, which is fine. I'm not knocking it. I'm just commenting on it. But these are not, as a rule, the risk-takers. They're more the play-it-safers. And while they can have good and successful careers all their working lives, the chances are against their hitting the big jackpot. Now, the reason I say this is because this sort of life, as a rule, does not encourage a man to do much more than he has to do, and he'll usually spend his free time, which comes to something like 72 hours a week when he's neither working nor sleeping, in pursuits not calculated to help him get ahead in the world. Now, the man who risks his spare time writing a book, painting pictures, fiddling with inventions, continuing his education, is generally the one in this kind of milieu who will advance above his fellows. But the man who risks all of his time on a goal he wants to reach, on a dream in his heart, who stakes his livelihood and the livelihood of his family upon his own brains and the proper use of his time, and tackles the world single-handed, here's the risk-taker to whom the spoils will generally accrue. Now, I'm not talking about the impractical dreamer and stargazer. I'm talking about the man of action who gets out and raises the dust in the world. He might take some king-size pratfalls and be snickered at by friends and relatives of a more conservative bent, but he'll usually make the grade if he stays with it, and earn their admiration, if not envy, before he's through. You know, one of the biggest factors in his favor is the size of the group he belongs to. According to the most reliable figures I can find, this risk-taker belongs to only about 2% of the population. And since he's generally working on an idea that will in some way serve the big 98%, the odds swing rather favorably to his side. Additionally, a man on his own must think. He must devote more of his days to thinking. Conversely, the man with a good steady job who's familiar with his work and surroundings can go along pretty well from day to day without doing any creative thinking at all. And as I said, we have a tendency to do no more than we have to. Anybody who spends a good deal of his time thinking is going to come up with a good idea once in a while. The law of averages is definitely on his side. And if you'll think about it a minute, you'll realize that he only needs a few, maybe only one really good idea to make it big. Now, the more you think about it and analyze it, the more it makes you think that what appears to be the risk-taker really isn't nearly as big a risk-taker as you might imagine. The cards are stacked pretty well for him from several important standpoints. But as I said in the beginning, the spoils definitely go to the risk-taker. Life is full of hidden contradictions. One is that the man who thinks he's playing it safe really isn't, and the man who seems to be taking the greatest risks, considering the law of averages, is playing it safest.
People who do well in the world, being creative and willing to take a calculated risk, are people who manage to overcome the fear of laughter. Anytime you attempt anything in which you risk failure, you run the risk of having people laugh at you. A college professor worked for many years on an invention. He tramped all over New England trying to interest capital in his device for making the human voice travel along a wire. The people laughed at him. It was, of course, plumb idiotic, they said, to suppose that the human voice could be carried along a wire and heard for many miles or even for a single mile. But our old friend and benefactor Alexander Graham Bell could not be laughed out of it, and every time we pick up the telephone, we salute the man who stayed on course despite the laughter. Millions of people laughing in derision could not hurt us an iota, but we stand in mortal terror of it. Men and women who can prove themselves heroes in great crises tremble before derision. It's a queer quirk of human nature we probably develop as children. It has cost much. It's changed the history of the world. Sometimes the price of a laugh has meant the slamming of a door of fame and fortune, or even immortality. Elias Howe invented the sewing machine, but it nearly rusted away before the American women stopped laughing about it and could be persuaded to make use of it. With their sewing done so quickly, they argued, what would they ever do with all their spare time? So a biographer paints a tragic picture. The man who had done more than any other to lighten the work of women was forced to borrow a suit of clothes on an occasion of a public appearance. Men are as bad as women when it comes to resisting new ideas. The typewriter had been a demonstrated success for years before businessmen could be persuaded to buy it. How could anyone have letters to write, they argued, to justify the investment of $100 in a writing machine? Only when the Remingtons sold patent rights to the Telegraph Company and two groups of salesmen worked in competition was the resistance finally broken down. Xerography faced the same kind of problem when it was first introduced, and other inventions have had similar battles. Here's an extract from a notebook of Robert Fulton, who invented the steamship, who changed the world from sail to steam on the oceans of the world. He wrote, "As I had occasion daily to pass to and from the shipyard where my boat was in progress, I often loitered near the groups of strangers and heard various remarks as to the object of this new vehicle. The language was uniformly that of scorn, sneer, or ridicule. The loud laugh often rose at my expense, the dry jest, the wise calculations of losses or expenditures, the dull repetition of Fulton's folly. Never did a single encouraging remark, a bright hope, a warm wish cross my path. Never did a single encouraging remark, a bright hope, a warm wish cross my path. And that's about what you can expect when you try something new." Emerson once commented that no one ever falls ill, but that passers-by idly hope that he will die. And the same perversity and built-in envy cause people to think or hope that any new idea or plan that runs counter to established principle will fail. Speaking of Emerson, he also wrote, "Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood." You know, we tend to forget that the greatest people, the greatest writers, the greatest teachers, were for the most part in violent disagreement with their times and the way things were being done. We seem to have become so flabby in our acceptance of anything that we fail to do anything personally about what we see about it. Norman Cousins has written that the biggest issue of all in the years just ahead is not just the squandering of physical resources, but the squandering of human resources. What constitutes failure? What does a person have to do or not do in order to fail? Herman Melville died in 1891. He wrote the book Moby Dick, the whaling epic, with its tremendous metaphysical concept of evil, at the age of 30. The book was published in 1851, sold a few copies, and then was promptly forgotten except by the limited connoisseurs of creative writing. Melville lived 40 years beyond publication of Moby Dick. He considered himself and his book a failure, and from a publisher's point of view, Melville was right. Of his other novels, Billy Budd remained unpublished for 40 years after his death, and like Moby Dick, has since become a literary classic. Today, sales of Melville's works run into the millions, but there is no retroactive compensation for the author's troubled soul or shoddy purse. So what is failure? Failure does not come to a person because he is not recognized by the multitudes during his lifetime or ever. Our success or failure has nothing to do with the opinions of others. It has only to do with our own opinion of ourselves and what we're doing. The only person that can be called a failure is that person who tries to succeed at nothing. Success, as far as a person is concerned, does not lie in achievement. It lies in striving, reaching, attempting. Any person who decides upon a course of action he deems to be worthy of him and sets out to accomplish that goal is a success right then and there. Therefore, failure consists not in failing to reach our goals, but rather in not establishing them. Failure consists of not trying, and certainly Melville and all the others who were not recognized until long after their death were successful during their lives because of the fact that they strove all of their lives and gave to their work the best that was in them. And for every Melville that we read about, there have been millions of men and women equally successful, of whom we'll never hear. People who didn't write books or try to save the world, but who, in their own quiet way, in their own places, gave to what they had chosen the best that was in them. Melville must have known deep within himself when he finished the last page of Moby Dick that he had not failed, just as each of us knows how much of himself he's giving to what it's been given him, what he has chosen to do. People who play it too safe take the greatest risks. Did you know that? In the long haul, the intelligent risk-takers develop the greatest security. It's a wise person who learns the importance of risk-taking. During World War II, psychologist E. Paul Torrance made a study of United States aces flying in the Pacific Theater of Operations. He reported that the most salient characteristic of the ace was his risk-taking ability. Throughout his life, he had kept testing the limits of his abilities, and the life histories of these men showed that they were highly resistant to accidents, and in combat they suffered fewer casualties than pilots who were inclined to play it safe. Dr. Torrance said, "Living itself is a risky business. If we spent half as much time learning how to take risks as we spend avoiding them, we wouldn't have nearly so much to fear in life." In all walks of life, the most successful people are the risk-takers. Now, by that I mean they risk believing in their own ideas, striking out toward their own goals, standing up for what they believe to be right. They take the risk of being different when they believe in something. Now, this has a tendency to make the going a little tougher for a while, but they almost always wind up ahead of the game eventually. Risk-takers realize there's nothing wrong with an occasional failure. The play-it-safers seem to think a failure means the end of the world. The risk-takers are not foolhardy. Getting back to the World War II aces for a moment, it was found that these men were very fussy about their airplanes, armament, and equipment. They were painstaking in preparation, highly disciplined in following instructions and what they'd been taught. But in an encounter with the enemy, they would immediately take charge and go on the offense. The best defense is often a good offense. The best pass defense in football is to rush the quarterback. When a storm comes up, ships in the harbor head for the raging open sea unless they're protected in slips. In the harbor, they could drag their anchors and wind up on the beach or the breakwater. So what appears to be risk-taking is often the most intelligent course to follow. It leads to security, while what would appear to be the safest course of action can lead to disaster or simply nowhere. A young woman whose romance had gone on the rocks told her mother that she was never going to permit herself to fall in love again. "You only get hurt," she said. "And if you don't fall in love," her mother said, "you don't live." It's another one of those risks the successful person is willing to take. Everyone runs risks, quite sizable risks, every day of his life, risks he takes for granted or isn't even aware of. But when an unusual situation comes along that involves risk-taking, how do you decide whether or not to go ahead? When a situation comes along that involves risk and you don't know whether to go ahead or hold back, reassess your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you working toward? Will taking this risk, if it works out successfully, help you toward your goals? There's nothing some people like to do better than to give advice. Unfortunately, a lot of advice that's dished out would have to be classified as useless information. If I had to pick a winner in the useless information department, it would probably be the advice that goes, look before you leap. It is a good recommendation for swimmers and jumpers, but as far as life is concerned, it's impossible to do. We can look backward. We can see the results of our past actions and learn from them, but we can't look into the future. In living, we can guess or try to predict what the future will hold, but we really can't look before we leap. As a result of this, most people simply don't leap at all. But it's a wonderful and little-known fact that for those who dare to attempt a new and seemingly difficult leap, the results are often surprisingly successful and rewarding. Now, this is something that needs some explaining and no little qualification. The leap we take should be in line with two important criteria. One, it should be towards something we want with all our heart. And two, it should be in a field in which we have a good background of experience, or at least in an area related to our past experience. Let me give you some examples. Lindbergh took the big leap when he flew nonstop across the Atlantic, the first one to ever do so. But behind him were years of flying experience, including flying the Mail in all kinds of weather with virtually no navigational aids. He couldn't see into the future as far as his success or failure was concerned, with failure probably meaning his death, but he was well prepared for the leap, and it made him rich and famous. Columbus did the same thing. He wanted to do something that had never been tried before. He believed it could be done, and he was a highly skilled sailor and navigator, and he had the best ships then available for the journey. All human progress is the result of this kind of thing, and on a much smaller scale, the same principle can be applied to our lives. If there's something you want very much to do, if you know it's right, and if you're prepared to try it, the chances are excellent that you'll meet with surprising success. And after you've taken the big jump, you'll probably wonder why you waited so long. Of course, there's always the risk of failure. Lindbergh could have been killed. Columbus's little fleet could have met with disaster. Einstein might have been wrong. Washington might have been defeated and hanged along with all the signers of the Declaration of Independence by the British. But the fact is, they were not. It brings to mind again the great lines spoken by Thucydides in his funeral speech for Pericles. The secret of happiness is freedom, and the secret of freedom, courage. You'll never get elected unless you expose yourself to defeat. You'll never make it to second base if you try to keep one foot on first. You'll never achieve the dream in your heart unless you take the big jump and are willing to risk everything, even failure, on the attempt. If it's what's right for you and you've prepared yourself as best you can for the attempt, the chances are excellent that you'll meet with success. As Lincoln put it, let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. No, you can't look before you leap, but you can leap.
Dr. Joyce Brothers has some good advice for the fearful. She points out that everyone is familiar with fear. Normal fear protects us and provides a warning signal indicating the presence of danger. A totally fearless person is probably not too intelligent and can look forward to a very short life. But when fear is inappropriate, it can stand in the way of progress and success. It can destroy love, create failure on the job, and interfere with our ability to relate well to others. Innovation and creativity involve risk, Dr. Brothers goes on to say. The person who's afraid to take chances, who's afraid of failure, is standing in the way of his progress. In fact, an emotionally healthy person needs challenge in life. Studies show that people who are cautious in the extreme, who are afraid to take risks even when the odds are in their favor, tend to be afraid of life itself, which of course is also a gamble. Such persons are not likely to succeed in business or anything else. So Dr. Brothers suggests that such people practice failure. How liberating it would be for the average person to be able to walk into a room, trip over a wastebasket, have all the people in the office laugh, and then be able to laugh with them. In fact, Dr. Brothers suggests that fearful people deliberately do such things to discover that an occasional failure is no disgrace, but rather a perfectly normal part of living.
I remember when I was just starting out in radio, I managed to get the part of Sky King, the lead in the famous children's radio program of that name, and I'd often be asked to make public appearances for school children. One day I flew up to Michigan to greet and sign autographs for several hundred children allowed out of school for the event. I flew there in a small two-seater airplane. I was dressed in my cowboy costume, from the hat to the cowboy boots, gun belt, the works. As I was trying to climb out of the airplane cockpit in my unaccustomed costume, while the hundreds of children watched and waited nearby, I caught my heel on the cockpit coaming and fell full length on the wing. Then I did a slow roll off the trailing edge of the wing to the ground. My guns fell out, my hat rolled away, and a death-like silence fell on the children. There was their hero, sprawled on the grass. He couldn't even get out of an airplane. Well, I picked up my guns, put my hat back on, and with a sheepish grin from ear to ear walked to the waiting children. We all had a good laugh about it, and I signed the autographs, and all went surprisingly well. And as I flew back to Chicago, I thought about how often children fall, and that they could easily empathize with me. Don't lose your sense of humor, and remember that even though they may laugh, people are kinder and more forgiving than we generally give them credit for being. Risks and pratfalls are a part of life. So is an occasional failure in other ways. And so is success. Lots of it. I had the good fortune to be raised near a harbor on the sea. As a kid, I used to spend hours down in the docks watching the ships loading and unloading. They'd bring in cargoes from the distant and romantic ports all over the world, and I used to stand there with a faraway look in my eyes, envying those sailors who were so fortunate to see and to travel to all those places. They traveled over the distant horizon to places I could only imagine or read about in my geography books. I hung around so much that some of the mates and skippers finally recognized me and actually invited me aboard. I guess you can imagine the heaven that was for me. They'd take me from the engine room to the forecastle and finally to the place I liked best, the navigation bridge. The bridge had the best view, but much more than that. It was there that the ship was controlled and steered into all those distant places I dreamed of. Once I was even invited to lunch, and I didn't get over that for months. It's strange how something like that can have such an overwhelming fascination for a youngster and exert such an influence over his life. As soon as I was old enough, I was on a ship, and I sailed to quite a few of those distant, deep-water ports. No matter how long the trip, I never got tired of sailing, being at sea, and watching the sea in all its different moods. Entering a different port, even if I'd been there before, was always a brand-new thrill. Over the years, I've tried to figure out why I like ships so much, and I believe I've come up with the answer. Ships operate the way people ought to, I believe, but so few do. Maybe you've never given it much thought, but at any given moment, a ship has a place to go, a direction. That is, either she's sailing to a predetermined port of call, or she's in port getting ready to sail to another one. You can climb up to the navigation bridge of a big far-sailing ship and ask the captain where he's going. He can tell you instantly and in one sentence. Now, how many people do you know who can do the same thing? It seems that most people want so many different things, or at least they think they want them, that they're unable to focus their efforts, their minds, their hearts on anything specific. And all this leads to is doubt and confusion. They're like the guy who jumped on a horse and rode off in all directions at once. They don't recognize how vital it is to pick one port that's important, then sail to it, rest and refit for a little while, then sail to another port. In this way, in not so many years, a person can set and reach his goals one by one until finally he has a tremendous pile of accomplishments in which he can take pride. He has all the things he wants, just because he had sense enough to realize he could do well only one thing at a time. There's another analogy that fits here, and maybe it makes the most important point of all. If a ship, tied to a dock, for some reason had no place to go, she'd stay there until she fell apart from rust and disuse. A ship's engine isn't started until she has someplace to go. Here again, it's the same with people. This is why it's so important that each of us has a port of call we want to reach, a goal, a place to get to that we feel would be better than the place in which we now find ourselves. If we don't, well, we might never cast off. We never really start our engine. We never know the thrill of sailing a charted course to a place we can't see for fully 99% of the journey. But we know it's there, and we know that if we keep sailing toward it, we'll reach it one day. If someone came up to you today and asked you what your next port of call is, that is, where you're going, could you answer him in one sentence, as could the captain on the bridge of his ship? If not, maybe you'd like to give it some thought. A clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Cornell University, Earl Nightingale, M.D., writes, "In my practice as a psychiatrist, I've found that helping people to develop personal goals has proved to be the most effective way to help them to cope with problems. Observing the lives of people who have mastered adversity, I have noted," he writes, "that they have established goals and sought with all their effort to achieve them. From the moment they decided to concentrate all their energies on a specific objective, they began to surmount the most difficult odds." So writes Dr. Kiev in his book, A Strategy for Daily Living. He writes, "The establishment of a goal is the key to successful living, and the most important step toward achieving an objective is first to define it. I'm sure you have at least 30 minutes a day," he writes, "in which to list your thoughts about possible goals. Set aside such a period each day for a month. At the end of that time, choose from the possible objectives you've listed the one that seems the most important, and record it separately on a single card. Carry this card with you at all times. Think about this objective every day. Create concrete mental images of the goal as if you've already accomplished it." The doctor points out that you can determine your special talents or strengths in a number of ways, ranging from psychological tests to an analysis of the unexpressed wishes in your dreams. No one method works for everyone. You might start, for example, by clipping and pasting newspaper articles that interest you. After 30 days, see if there isn't some trend suggestive of a deep-seated interest or natural inclination. Keep alert to the slightest indications of any special skills or talents, even when they seem silly or unimportant. From this exercise, you should be able to get some sense of potential strength. Whenever you discover a strength or talent, think of 5 possible ways to develop it. Write these down on a card as well, and check them periodically to keep them fresh in your mind. Focus on one objective at a time. Like a servo mechanism, the brain, set on a target, will call into play those mental processes that will bring your efforts to fruition. Your actions will conform to your expectations, thereby bringing about the event. If you believe that you will reach your objective, you will continue to work at a task until you have accomplished it. And he suggests that we be aware of situations that generate the 5 great enemies of peace. They are avarice, ambition, envy, anger, and pride. Petrarch said, "If those enemies were to be banished, we should infallibly enjoy perpetual peace." Old advice, perennial advice, and perennially forgotten. It's been said that we need reminding as much as we need educating. Even Petrarch in the 14th century knew all about this subject. Dr. Kiev got the idea of writing his book because of a young businessman who visited his office saying that he needed a set of guidelines to follow that would let him function without professional help in the face of considerable confusion and despair caused by serious personal problems. So take the good and free advice of the psychiatrist, Dr. Earl Nightingale, and don't be afraid of failure. As Herodotus wrote, "It is better by noble boldness to run the risk of being subject to half of the evils we anticipate than to remain in cowardly listlessness for fear of what may happen." Did you ever wonder where those human dynamos, those people who can pack as much work into one day as most of us do in 2, get all the energy and drive that makes them go? Well, the source of drive and energy in human beings is known. It's the personal excitement that comes from a great motivating desire. If you ask most people why they get out of bed in the morning and slug away all day on the job, they'll probably have to think about it a while before coming up with an answer. When they do, it's usually along the line of, to pay the rent or to put food on the table. Answers like these aren't exciting. I belong to the group that thinks life is far too short to be dull. Shelter and food are things we need, but unless we're living out in the street or starving to death, we're not apt to get too excited about a place to sleep or something to eat. Those who have no exciting reason for getting out of bed in the morning may be fine people, but they never seem to accomplish anything out of the ordinary, and they miss a lot of fun and a lot of rewards they could be enjoying. They haven't the drive to become outstanding because they don't have a great motivating desire. The key that unlocks energy is desire. It's also the key to a long and interesting life. If we expect a person to do something we want him to do, we have to get him excited. And if we expect to create any drive, any real force within ourselves, we have to get excited. We have to decide upon something we desire very much. A goal that fires our imagination with a mental picture of having something, doing something, or being something. In a company we surveyed while preparing these messages, one of the men had won the admiration of all the others. We noticed that he had thorough knowledge of his company, its products, markets, and competitors. He took pains to understand his customers and their problems. These things, along with an easy manner and a good personality, marked him as an outstanding employee. We asked him about all this, and he said, "When I came with this company a few years back, I decided to shoot for a manager's job in one of our districts. I'm doing everything I can to be the kind of man who would have that job." Well, that explained it. In his mind, he was already running his own district. The rest of him was merely carrying out the motions that would soon propel him into the job he wanted. Meanwhile, he was enjoying himself tremendously. The mental image of being a district manager so appealed to him that he found all the enthusiasm, energy, and drive he was going to need to achieve that position. Everything he said and did in his current job had to conform to the image he held in his mind. He was outstanding because nothing less than his best would fit with the goal he'd picked out. Of course he'll get that district manager's job and all that goes with it. People with unusual drive and energy, people who excel, are the ones who have given themselves a mental picture, a goal to work toward. And the amount of drive they possess will always be in exact proportion to the strength of their desire to make that mental picture a reality, to reach that goal. We don't have to worry about setting a goal we can never reach. That's the strange and wonderful thing about humans, something that most people seem to miss. We never seriously desire anything we can't possibly have. If you get all fired up over something, whether it's an executive position in your company, the income you feel you and your family need to do the things you want to do and have the things you want, being the sort of person who makes a real contribution, sets a fine example, helps others on their way up, if you can clearly envision how it will feel to satisfy your desire, well, then it can be yours. Arnold Bennett wrote that the kind of desire that triggers drive and energy within us isn't some vague hankering, some undefined wish. The productive kind of desire is real, it's concrete, it's a mental picture that will never leave us alone. It's always there in front of our minds, prodding and poking, goading us on. It's an obsession, a whip. It has no mercy, and we'll never be satisfied until we've achieved that which we truly desire. Well, how about you? What's your goal? What is it that gets you fired up every time you think about it? If you have such a goal, you'll never have to worry about the drive and energy you'll need to achieve it. But if you find that you lack drive, that you're short on energy, give it some thought. Decide upon the dream that's more important to you than any other. Then begin to make that dream a reality. You can, and you'll find that you've got all the drive you need, all the energy you want. To achieve your goals in life, create a desire within yourself. Then direct the energy and drive it generates toward getting whatever you want. It's been truthfully said, what the mind of man can conceive and believe, it can achieve. There's a great fact that the average person tends to lose sight of, or simply doesn't know. It's that each of us has the power and the energy, though we may be unaware of it, to achieve those things and conditions we want very much. Energy cannot be created in anyone, but understand that it's there, in others and in yourself, a great and powerful sleeping giant waiting only to be awakened. The waking agent is desire. So your desire to attain a worthy personal goal will unleash abundant energy for you. All you will need to travel an exciting, interesting, and fulfilling road through life to the destinations of your choice. There's a story about a man hunting tigers in India who was suddenly surprised by a huge Bengal tiger. It was almost on top of him. The man raised his rifle and fired, but he overshot and missed. The tiger, frightened by the man and thrown off stride by the noise of the gun, leaped toward the hunter, but the leap was too wide and he missed his prey. The man returned to camp and spent several hours perfecting his aim for short distances and quick firing. On the following day, he again stalked the tiger. Finally, he spotted the beast at some distance. The tiger was practicing short leaps. It's a charming little story, and it started me thinking about a subject it seems we can't say too much about. Goals. Did you ever sit down and make a list of everything you want? It's a very interesting experiment, and you'll make some surprising discoveries. You might find that you already have managed to get most of the things you wanted seriously, or if you don't have most or all of them, chances are you're now in the process of getting them. If your list contains some items you want very much but don't have, you might ask yourself why you failed to get them. Chances are that you haven't tried very hard. Or perhaps you felt, for one reason or another, that these things are completely beyond your ability to achieve. But on second look, they might make very worthwhile goals. At any rate, it's a good idea to have two lists of things you want. The first list would include those bigger goals that relate to your career or the overall good of your life, your family. These might include the position and or income you're working toward, perhaps a higher educational degree, a certain amount of money in your savings account, a plateau of business success, or that beautiful home you've had your eye on. The other list could be a fun list. It might include the car you want for no good reason except it's the car you happen to want, redecorating the house, getting new furniture, traveling to some special place, perhaps abroad, buying a new wardrobe. This is a list of things you just want because you want them. Now here's where the story of the tiger comes in. We should all have the long-range goals. These should be our number one list, and each of them should be numbered in the order of its importance to us. These are the goals that might take 5 years or longer to achieve. They're extremely worthwhile to us, and we should be working toward them daily. These are the goals that give meaning and direction and substance to our lives. But we also need short-range goals. These are the goals that add zest and interest to our lives and fun and break up the monotony of the long haul for the long-range goals. We need to practice these short jumps, too. If you're honest with yourself about the things you want, not idle will-o'-the-wisp wishes that change from day to day, but things you're serious about, you'll find that they can all be yours if they're taken one at a time, and in a surprisingly short time. It's been said that people can have anything they want. The trouble is, they don't know what they want. Get off by yourself for a quiet hour or two and make up your own two lists. It's fun and very rewarding.
Here are some interesting questions for you. You might want to try answering them. 1. If you could completely change places with any other person in the world, would you do it? And who would that person be? 2. If you could work at any job you could choose, would that work be different from the work you're now doing? 3. If you could live in any part of the country you want to live in, would you move from where you're now living? 4. If you could go back to age 12 and live your life from that point over again, would you do it? Studies indicated that the great majority of people, even though they evince a certain amount of dissatisfaction with their present lives and don't seem to be as happy as they might be, will answer no to all 4 questions. What brought this to mind is an attorney friend of mine who confided that now that he's accomplished everything he's worked and struggled for so long to achieve, he finds himself depressed more and more of the time. He has a fine practice and an excellent income, a beautiful home, a wife and children to whom he's devoted. In fact, everything is finally just as he'd planned it for so many years. And for no reason that he can put his finger on, all the fun and enthusiasm has strangely disappeared. He's listless and unhappy, and he can't think of a single reason why. This has become a common modern melody, and it's what so often happens when a person runs out of goals. This is when the game of life begins to go to pot, and the person needs to remind himself of some of the basic rules for successful, enthusiastic living. And the first rule is that a human being must have something worthwhile toward which he's working. Without that, everything else, even the most remarkable achievements of the past and all the trappings of worldly success, tend to turn sour. Achieving our life goals can be compared to opening our presents on Christmas morning and watching those we love open theirs. We look forward to the day, plan, and work toward it. Suddenly it's there. All the presents have been opened, and then what? Well, we must then turn our thoughts and attention to other things. The successful novelist begins planning his next book before he completes the one he's working on. The scientist always has something new and challenging to turn to when he completes a project. The teacher has a new class coming up. The young family has children to raise and get through school, the new home to buy, the promotion to work for. But for millions who reach their 40s and 50s and find they've done all they set out to do, and that there are no new challenges to give them stimulus and direction, there often comes the most trying time of their lives, the search for meaning, for new meaning. And it must be found if the old interest and vitality are to be restored to their lives, if they're to achieve renewal as persons. If they understand this, even the search for new meaning can bring new interest into their lives. They've got to say to themselves, all right, I've done what I set out to do. Now I must find something new and interesting to do. Getting back to our questions,
The thought of going back to age 12 fills most people with a dread bordering on horror. They wouldn't do it for anything. And the upshot of the whole thing is that most people are living lives they themselves have fashioned and have or are getting what they really want, or at least what they're willing to settle for. And when this is brought to their attention, they often begin to get a lot more enjoyment from the life they've got. They begin to enjoy themselves more and realize that things aren't so bad after all. If you're going to be a big success as a human being, you have to fit into one of two groups, or belong to both of them, it seems to me. So let's talk about these two groups of very successful men and women. The first group belongs to what I call the river. These are men and women who have found, often early in life, although not always, a great river of interest into which they throw themselves with exuberance and abandon. They're quite happy to spend their lives working and playing in that river. For some, the river may be a particular branch of science. For others, one of the arts. There are some physicians, for example, who are so wrapped up in medicine they hate to leave it. Even after a 16-hour day, they can't wait to get back to it. For others, quitting time comes as a welcome reward when they can indulge themselves in other interests. There are some people who are happiest and most alive when they're in their river, in whatever business or career or profession it happens to be. And success comes to such people as inevitably as a sunrise. In fact, their success is the moment they find their great field of interest. The worldly trappings of success will always come in time. Such people don't have to ask, what shall I do with my life? Their work is a magnet for them, and they can't imagine doing anything else. We all know such people or about such people. Doing what they do is even more important to them than the rewards they earn for doing it. So much for the river people. The second group of successful people are those who are goal-oriented. These people have not found necessarily a particular river and can be quite happy doing a number of things. It's the goals they set that are important to them, and they're quite aware that there are many roads that can lead to their goals. Someone once said, Americans can have anything they seriously make up their minds to have. The trouble is that most of them never make up their minds about anything. Goal-oriented people do make up their minds about what they want, and they keep their eyes and their enthusiasm on the goal they've established until it becomes a reality in their lives. Then they set a new goal, if they're wise. One of the problems with this latter group is that after achieving a number of goals and becoming quite successful, they can run out of goals and become listless and unhappy. But not the river people. Their interest in what they're doing never fades. So if you're going to be a big success, chances are you need to be a river person or a goal-oriented person. Or both. The two groups, you see, are not mutually exclusive. How about you? I read a great Greek poem by C.P. Kathafi titled Ithaca, and in it we're reminded that it is the voyage and the adventures on the way that count, not the arrival itself. Old Cervantes said the same thing. This seems to be a most difficult truth to understand. It's not to say that a person's goal in life is unimportant. On the contrary, it's vital. For without a goal, a distant destination, we wouldn't begin the trip at all. Instead, we'd run around in circles, endlessly following the shoreline round and round our tiny island. Every person needs a great and distant goal toward which to strive, but in traveling toward it, he should try to keep in mind that the fabled land he seeks has shores much like the one he left behind, that its purpose is not so much a resting place, but rather the reason for the trip. Where a person goes is not nearly as important as how he gets there. That a house is built is not all that important. It's the manner in which it's built that makes it great, average or poor. That we live is not nearly as important as the manner in which we live. I think that it's misunderstanding this that often keeps people in a state of unhappiness and anxiety. They forget to enjoy the trip. They forget what they're really looking for, or what they should be looking for, the discovery of themselves. This is the island toward which everyone should journey. It's a difficult journey, beset like the travels of Ulysses with many dangers and hardships. But it gives real meaning to life, and there are many rich rewards to be found along the way, all kinds of serendipitous benefits. It means asking the questions that are hard to answer. Where am I going? Why am I going there? What do I really want, and why do I want it? Am I making the best possible use of myself as a person? Am I gradually realizing my potential? Am I discovering my best talents and abilities and using them to their fullest? Am I living fully extended in my one chance at life on earth? Am I really living? Who am I? These are the questions everyone must ask himself and answer. As Emerson said, though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us, or we find it not. Whatever you're looking for must first be found within you, whether it be peace or happiness or riches or great accomplishments. Everything we do outwardly is only an expression of what we are inwardly at the time. To ask for anything else is as absurd as looking for apples on an oak tree. So the person who knows what he wants knows what he must become, and so he fixes his attention on the preparation and development of himself. And as he grows toward the ideal he holds in his mind, he finds interest and zest and joy on the journey. He looks forward to tomorrow, but he also enjoys today, for it is the tomorrow he looked forward to yesterday. He knows that if he cannot find meaning and value in his present, it will very likely be missing in his future. Today is the future of 5 years ago. Are you enjoying it as much as you thought you would? Have you progressed to the point you wanted then to reach? These are the questions that make us think.
Seizing opportunity, embracing the challenge of risk, and setting goals that get to the very heart of your desires. The remaining element needed for habitual, lifelong achievement has a mixture of ingredients. Patience, durability, and will are part of this formula that creates one of the most rewarding characteristics of mankind, persistence. As it has been said, nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not, nothing is more common. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Earl Nightingale offers some thoughtful comments on how to enhance our instinctual need to persist, starting with just one single step. The issue of being misunderstood gets some treatment, as we hear how old-fashioned tenacity can be confused with ruthlessness.
When a child is born, he or she comes equipped with certain basic drives that psychologists have been listing for us for many years. And to my mind, one of the most interesting of these basic drives is the one we might call the drive to go on, the virtually indestructible tendency on the part of a human being to keep going, to wait for one more sunrise, to try just one more time, and then once more again, and again. No matter how crushed, how defeated, how demoralized, when all hope seems gone, there is, in the healthy person, a small, inextinguishable flame of hope, like a faint but persistent pilot light that stays alive much like the fire ancient man used to carry with him as he moved from place to place. It's been seen in the faces of men, women, and children escaping from behind the Iron Curtain, and refugees from countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan. It was still smoldering in the shrunken faces of the victims of Hitler's death camps when they were liberated by the Allied soldiers at the close of World War II. It's what causes a person to keep putting one foot in front of the other on what seems like an endless road with no destination in sight. And it's this natural drive to go on, to keep trying, that's responsible for man's progress through the long centuries. Almost everyone comes to a place in life where going on seems futile, even ridiculous, when he seems overwhelmed by a suffocating mattress of events and situations, and the desire just to sit down in the middle of his road and let the world and everything in it go to blazes. So he sits down for a while. But then the vibration of the world seems to make itself felt in his bones. Pretty soon he raises his head and begins to look around. After a while he takes a couple of deep breaths, gets slowly, painfully to his feet, wobbles there for a minute or two, and then he starts out again. Often as not, around the next bend in the road he'll find the reason he kept going, and he'll shudder at the thought of how close he came to giving up. His hope lies in movement and time. If he doesn't get up and start moving again, he's done for. But he has this natural drive to keep moving along the road. As long as he keeps heading for what he's looking for, what seemed like the end of the world for him will be nothing more than a bad dream, and a part of the preparation he needed to qualify for the achievement his perseverance has brought. Movement, time, and the law of averages. I remember reading about the manager of a Major League ball club who kept a rookie on the team and in the lineup because even though he wasn't hitting anywhere near what was expected of him, when he struck out swinging. He wasn't just standing there watching strikes go by. And as the manager expected, he soon started getting wood on the ball and bringing his average up to where it belonged. Discouragement seems to be a part of life. But the reason people prevail is because of this built-in drive to keep going.
Willpower has been called persistence. It's the knack of staying with something, the sustained effort necessary to induce absolute faith. Persistence is an essential factor in the procedure of transmuting the thoughts of what you'd like to have into their reality. Now, the basis of persistence is the power of will. Willpower and desire, when properly combined, as we've been shown down through the pages of history and are being shown on every side today, willpower and desire, when properly combined, make an irresistible pair. Men who accumulate great fortunes, for example, are sometimes known as cold-blooded, ruthless capitalists. But often they're misunderstood. What they have is willpower, which they mix with persistence and place back of their desires to ensure the attainment of their particular objectives. Henry Ford was generally misunderstood, thought to be ruthless and cold-blooded. And this misconception grew out of Ford's habit of following through in all of his plans with persistence. For example, I know the story that is reported to be absolutely true of when he wanted the first V8 engine cast, the block for a V8 engine cast. It had never been done before. As you know, he was the originator of the V8 engine. But he couldn't do it. But that's what he wanted, so he called in his top engineers and told them that's what he wanted. They said that can't be done. It's never been done, it's impossible, and so on. And he stopped their talking and said, go do it, that's what I'm paying you for. So they went, and in 3 months, after the most assiduous studying and research, they came back and told him again that his principle, whatever it involved, and I'm not a mechanic myself, but whatever it was, involved a process that was impossible, couldn't be done. It violated every known premise. So he gave them a talking to, and he says, now I don't want to hear from you again until you come back here with that V8 block. Go cast it, go do it. I don't care about any of these other things. Go do it anyway. And they came back with it. And the V8 engine was born. It was his habit of persistence regardless. And he didn't let the thoughts of other people, even though he only had a little bit of education himself, he wouldn't let a bunch of university-graduated engineers tell him that the thing couldn't be done. So they did it anyway. The majority of people are ready to throw their aims and purposes overboard and give up at the first sign of opposition or misfortune. Now, you know that's true, and so do I. But a few carry on despite all opposition until they get their goal. And these few are they have been the Fords, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the Edisons, and so on. There may be no heroic connotation to the word persistence, but the quality is to the character of man what carbon is to steel. And the building of whatever it is you really want for yourself and your family generally involves the application of willpower along with the other factors necessary. Now, unless you happen to be one out of the 2 out of every 100 people who already have a definite goal at which you're aiming and a definite plan for its attainment, you ought to think about this. Because just about 2 people out of every 100 definitely know what it is they want to do. Now, the starting point of all achievement or all willpower naturally is desire for something. It would be worthless without it. Now, you should really keep this constantly in mind. And the importance is that to desire something very much is right, and that's human. To not desire anything very much is animal-like, subhuman. Weak desires bring weak results, just as a small amount of fire makes a small amount of heat. And if you find yourself kind of short on persistence, this weakness may be remedied by building a stronger fire under your desires. You know, it seems that fortunes gravitate to men whose minds have been prepared to attract them, just as surely as water gravitates to the ocean. And if you find that you're a little weak in persistence, center your attention upon getting for yourself a definite purpose. Spasmodic or occasional effort to apply the rules of persistence and willpower won't help too much. To get results, you have to apply them all the time until they become a habit. And in no other way can you develop the necessary consciousness of achievement. It seems that poverty, by going over past history, is attracted to the person whose mind is favorable to it, as the opposite of poverty is attracted to him whose mind has been deliberately prepared to attract it, and through the same laws. Poverty consciousness, which was so widespread during the Depression, for example, will voluntarily seize the mind which is not occupied with achievement consciousness. And a poverty consciousness develops without conscious application of habits favorable to it. So the opposite must be created. You do it artificially. You actually create something that you really want. Persistence, willpower. If you've ever experienced a nightmare, you'll realize the value of persistence. You're lying in bed half awake, maybe with a feeling that you're about to smother. You're unable to turn over or to move a muscle. But even so, you realize that you must begin to regain control over your muscles. Has that ever happened to you? Well, through persistent effort of willpower, you finally manage to move the fingers of one hand. By continuing to move your fingers, you extend your control to the muscles of one arm until you can lift it. Then you gain control of the other arm in the same manner. You finally gain control over the muscles of one leg and then extend it to the other leg. And then with one supreme effort of will, you regain complete control over your muscular system and snap out of your nightmare. The trick has been turned step by step. And many people today find that it's necessary to snap out of their mental inertia through a similar procedure, moving slowly at first and then increasing their speed until they gain complete control over their will. But be persistent no matter how slowly you may at first have to move, because with persistence comes the thing you have your mind set on. Now, there's no substitute for persistence. It can't be supplanted by any other quality. Those who have cultivated the habit of persistence seem to enjoy insurance against failure, because no matter how many times they suffer defeat, they finally arrive up toward the top of the ladder.
Have you ever noticed that the longer you look at something you should be doing, the more difficult it seems to appear, and that the longer you put off something you should do, the more difficult it is to get started? A good deal of frustration and unhappiness could be avoided if people would just do what they know they should do. The great newspaper editor Arthur Brisbane once wrote, "Don't exaggerate your own importance, your own size, or your own miseries. You are an ant in a human anthill. Be a working ant, not a ridiculous insect pitying yourself." Strong language, maybe, but there's a lot of sense in it. A person carrying a heavy weight is all right as long as he keeps moving. The minute he stops, puts the weight on the ground, and sits down to rest, the weight seems to become heavier, the distance to be traveled greater, and the work just that much more unpleasant. Sometimes it must seem to everyone that things have piled up so high there's just no way of digging out. But there is. Pick the thing that's most important to do and simply begin doing it. Just by digging in you'll feel better, and you'll find that it's not nearly as bad as you thought it would be. Keep at it, and before long the pile of things to do that seemed so overwhelming is behind you. Finished. What overwhelms us isn't the work itself, it's thinking how hard it's going to be. It's seeing it get larger every day. It's putting it off and hoping that somehow, through some miracle, it will disappear. The Chinese have a saying that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step, and that step accomplishes two things. First, it automatically shortens the distance we still have to travel, and secondly, and just as important, it makes us feel better, more hopeful. It strengthens our faith, and if a person will just keep putting one foot in front of the other, he'll be taken into new and exciting places, see new and interesting things, and think thoughts that never would have come to him if he'd remained at the starting point. And then, finally, the journey is finished. He wonders how or why he could ever have sat so long and worried and stewed about the time and trouble it would involve to do what he knew he should do. If you'll think back, you'll remember that you've always been happiest, most contented, after having finished a difficult project or faced up to a responsibility you were worried about. It's never as bad as you think it's going to be, and the joy that will come with its accomplishment makes it more than worthwhile. Work never killed anyone. It's worry that does the damage, and the worry would disappear if we just settle down and do the work. As Calvin Coolidge put it, all growth depends upon activity. There's no development, physically or intellectually, without effort, and effort means work. Work is not a curse. It is the prerogative of intelligence, the only means to manhood, and the measure of civilization. Mary Pickford used to say, "Don't look at the sudden loss of a habit or a way of life as the end of the road. See it instead as only a bend in the road that will open up all sorts of interesting possibilities and new experiences. After all, you've seen the scenery on the old road for so long, and you obviously no longer like it." The breaking of a long-held habit does seem like the end of the road at the time, the complete cessation of enjoyment. Suddenly dropping the habit so fills our minds with a desire for the old habitual way that for a while it seems there'll no longer be any peace or any sort of enjoyment. But that's not true. New habits form in a surprisingly short time, and a whole new world opens up to us. For those who have tried repeatedly to break a habit of some kind only to repeatedly fail, Mary Pickford said, "Falling is not failing unless you fail to get up." Most people who finally win the battle over a habit they've wanted to change have done so only after repeated failures, and it's the same with most things. So don't think of it as the end of the road, but as a bend in the road, and falling is not failing unless we fail to get up again. I remember in Arthur Miller's play, The Price, the father who lost everything during the stock market crash of 1929, and who for the rest of his life sat in a room in the attic of a home of a relative. That's failing. It seems some people lack the stamina, the energy to do it all over again or to make a new start. For them, it's just the end of the road, and they come to a full stop. Many lead such superficial lives, have so little depth of mind and spirit that the sudden loss of income or material things is too much for them, and they jump out a window or retreat into insanity. I remember hearing the story of the little boy who wanted to get over the backyard fence. He stood for a long time looking at the fence, and then slowly, with many falls and failures, he dragged a box to the fence. Again, after many attempts and falls, he managed to get to the top of the box, but he still couldn't reach the top of the fence. He set to work once again, this time getting a smaller box to place on top of the big box. Again, many falls, having to get back on his feet, much tugging and pushing and lifting and dropping, but he finally got it to the top of the big box, laboriously clambered to the top of it, grasped the top of the fence, and flopped over. Then he came back home. So if you've been trying to start in a new direction, you might do well to remember the advice of Mary Pickford. It isn't the end of the road, it's just a bend in the road. And falling isn't failing, unless you don't get up again. Many years ago, I discovered Professor William James' wonderful little book on human reserves. In it, he says that everyone knows what it is to start a piece of work, either intellectual or physical, feeling stale. And everyone knows what it is to warm up to his work. The process of warming up is particularly striking in the phenomenon known as second wind. Now, usually, most people stop working at the first sign of fatigue. They say, "Boy, I'm bushed, and that's it for the day." As Dr. James put it, we have then walked, played, or worked enough, so therefore we desist. We simply quit. This sort of fatigue forms a kind of wall inside of which, as a rule, we work and live our lives. But if an unusual necessity forces us to press onward, a surprising thing occurs. The fatigue gets worse up to a certain critical point. Then gradually, or suddenly, it passes away, and we find we're fresher than before. We've evidently tapped a level of new energy that had until then been masked by the fatigue barrier we usually obey. In fact, we may have discovered that we have third and fourth winds. This phenomenon occurs in mental activity as well as physical, and in some cases we may find, beyond the fatigue point, stores of energy that we never dreamed we possessed. Evidently, we stockpile reserves of energies we don't ordinarily use, and these reserves will go to work only when we demand enough of ourselves. Only a few exceptional persons make any serious demands of themselves. The great majority of us miss the far greater accomplishments of which we're capable, and the greater joy in living this would bring us because we quit and sit down, gasping at the first sign of fatigue. I remember one Sunday when I knew I had to write 10 radio shows all in one day. I got started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon I was so bushed I could hardly think. But I still had 5 shows to write, so I kept at it. All of a sudden I felt better and had more energy than I had previously, and by 1:30 the next morning, when I finally finished, I felt great. 16.5 hours of steady mental work, and I was fresh as a daisy. But I felt like quitting after only 7 or 8 hours. The next time you get tired and you're doing something important, well, stay with it and see what happens. Each of us has a tremendous second wind, mental and physical. Passing through the fatigue barrier to draw upon our idle reserves can make the difference between existing and really living. Emerson said, "Vigor is contagious, and whatever makes us either think or feel strongly adds to our power and enlarges our field of action."
Dorothy Van Doren, the editor and author, in Words to Live By, chose some words of St. Francis of Assisi. She chose the words, "I would finish hoeing my garden." Now, these words were St. Francis' answer when someone asked him while working in his garden what he would do if he were suddenly to learn that he would die at sunset that day. He said, "I would finish hoeing my garden." And they seem to me, Dorothy Van Doren writes, they seem to me an answer to all the troubled young people these days who are beginning life in a world that appears to hold no security for them or for anyone, young or old. Why should they bother to go to college when the atom war is just around the corner, some people will say? Why should a young wife have a baby when the ceiling may collapse on its crib? Why should one paint a picture or write a song or begin a novel? We can't be sure of anything, these young people say, not now or next year or the year after that. Why should we try to make a life for ourselves, they ask? Why should we go to classes or take examinations or get married or look for an apartment or try for a job? Next spring or some spring too frighteningly near, it may all go, the life we've begun. Our world is in deadly peril. We've lost the promise of tomorrow, they'll say. Well, St. Francis put the answer in a simple metaphor. Go on hoeing your garden. The task is still here, the house to build, the book to write, the examination to prepare for.
If the future looks dark, so did it on the morning before the first Christmas. And however dark it seems today, however dark it is, she writes, we shall meet life better if we have fulfilled the present to the best of our ability. Today is still ours, along with the obligation to live it to the full. And as St. Francis said, we must go on hoeing our garden.